Let me tell you about Chen Ping'an, and let me tell you right now that nothing about what I'm going to say is going to make sense. Not at first, not in the middle, and honestly not even at the end, because Chen Ping'an himself doesn't make sense. He is, by every measurable standard, a completely ordinary mortal human being who has been living in a cultivation world for 5 years and cannot cultivate. He cannot sense spiritual energy. He cannot fly. He cannot form a core. He cannot do literally anything that every other person in this world does as a matter of basic daily function. He is, in the technical terminology of this realm, a waste, a non-entity, a normal person who stumbled through a dimensional rift and landed somewhere he absolutely does not belong. That is the story he knows. That is the story he tells everyone he meets. That is the story the universe is allowing him to believe, for reasons that will become obvious very shortly and that are frankly the funniest thing I have ever witnessed across multiple planes of existence. Because here is what Chen Ping'an does not know about himself. The weeding hoe he uses to tend his garden, the small, unassuming iron hoe that he grabbed from a supply stall 5 years ago and uses to dig up vegetables, is a divine artifact of transcendent power that would reduce most cultivation sect armories to tears of envy. The fish in his pond, the ones he feeds every morning and occasionally talks to about his day, are primordial sacred creatures. Specifically, the black one he calls Old Black is a 10,000-year-old gold dragon that has been sleeping in pond form because it respects Chen Ping'an too much to reveal itself, and also because the pond has good water temperature. The chicken his neighbor gave him that he roasts on special occasions is a phoenix. An actual phoenix. One of the legendary creatures that cultivation sects spend 10 generations of combined effort just to locate the territory of. It is currently living in a cage in his backyard, eating grain, being called Xiaoji, because Chen Ping'an thought it was a particularly colorful hen. It has not corrected him. It has been thinking about correcting him for 5 years and keeps deciding against it because the grain is good and the yard is peaceful. And Chen Ping'an talks to it about his day with a sincerity that the phoenix finds unexpectedly touching. The kitchen knife hanging in his house, the one he uses to cut vegetables and occasionally chop firewood, has a cultivation level that surpasses divine artifacts at the transcendent tier. It has been making very quiet, very dignified peace with its situation for 5 years. It has developed opinions about the best way to cut daikon. It considers this period of its existence the most intellectually stimulating it has ever had. His entire house, every object in it, every plant in his garden, the soil beneath his feet, all of it is soaked in Tao energy, so dense and so ancient that senior cultivators who enter his front courtyard experience immediate involuntary prostration and hearing damage from the sheer accumulated weight of the aura. He has no idea. He genuinely, completely, from the depths of his soul, has no idea. He thinks the vegetables are just very well fertilized because the soil is good. He thinks the fish are lively because he feeds them regularly. He thinks the chicken is a nice pet. He is wrong about absolutely everything, and the universe finds this extremely funny. Now add to this the system. 5 years ago, when Chen Ping'an landed in this cultivation world, a system activated in his mind. The kind of system that protagonist types typically use to become unstoppable cultivation geniuses in a matter of weeks. Chen Ping'an's system is not that system. Chen Ping'an's system assigns him tasks, life tasks. Ordinary, mundane, occasionally humiliating tasks that range from resolve a marital dispute between neighbors, to teach children how to make paper boats to help the elderly woman at the end of the lane carry her groceries. He has been doing this for 5 years. He cannot advance his cultivation. The system has a 1,000-task requirement before any cultivation unlock becomes available. And his rewards have been exclusively things like a spiritually enhanced soil mix, a high-efficiency cooking pot, a cup that keeps beverages at optimal temperature, and once, memorably, a mop. He has, in the 5 years since his arrival, become very good at mopping. He has also, through sheer exposure to the ambient energy of his completely insane household, becomes so saturated with divine power that he unconsciously exerts a spiritual pressure equivalent to a being at the peak of the celestial realm just by existing in a room. He still thinks he is normal. He thinks about this sometimes, the fact that he hasn't advanced, that he can't feel spiritual energy the way other people describe it, that the cultivation path seems genuinely closed to him, and he has made peace with it the way that practical, grounded people make peace with limitations. He cooks, he gardens, he does his tasks, he talks to his fish. He is, in the most authentic sense of the word, content. The system, watching this, has developed what can only be described as a complicated emotional relationship with his continued wrongness about his own situation. It was on an otherwise unremarkable morning, task 47 of the month, a minor dispute between two vegetable sellers over a shared market stall, resolved through patient conversation and a diagram showing that both parties' claimed territory did not actually overlap when measured correctly, that the system finally gave him a task that broke from the pattern. He was sitting in his courtyard afterward, feeling the particular tiredness of someone who has spent a morning being diplomatically reasonable about other people's problems, when the task board lit up differently than usual. He leaned forward. The instruction read, "Join the Leaning Mountain Sect." He stared at it. He read it again. He spat out his tea. The system added in smaller text beneath the main instruction a message that said, "A man should strive for self-improvement, achieve 3 goals." He stared at this even longer. The goals were listed: gain membership, establish sufficient reputation, and hold a position of significance. He set down the tea. He looked at the courtyard. He looked at Old Black in the pond, who was floating with the specific serenity of something very old and very powerful, pretending to be a large, decorative fish. He looked at the chicken. The chicken looked back with an expression that, had he been able to interpret Phoenix facial expressions, communicated something like, "This should be interesting." He sighed the sigh of a man who has accepted his life as a continuous series of implausible events. "Fine," he said. "Let's go find the Leaning Mountain Sect." The system offered no navigation. It never offered navigation. He had stopped expecting it. He set off walking in a direction that felt generally mountainous, which turned out to be the correct instinct simply by virtue of the fact that most cultivation sects in this world were on or near mountains, and mountains were not evenly distributed across flat plains. He had walked for about 3 hours, during which time he identified 4 interesting herbs by the roadside, helped a lost goat find its owner, and ate most of the dried fruit he'd packed when something fell from the sky, not metaphorically. An actual person, a young woman in sect robes, dropped from somewhere very high in the atmosphere with the trajectory of someone who had been thrown by a force considerably larger than normal human capability, and hit the ground approximately 20 meters ahead of him with an impact that created an actual crater. The ground shook. He felt it in his feet. He ran over. He peered down into the crater. The young woman opened her eyes, saw him standing above her with the small stick he'd been using to poke at interesting rocks, and her expression moved through several stages: confusion, then pain, then rapid assessment, then desperate relief. She hauled herself to sitting. She grabbed his sleeve. "Please, Senior, save me." He looked at her hand on his sleeve. He looked at the stick. He looked at himself. "Senior," she said again, more urgently. He started to explain that he was immortal, that he had no cultivation, that the stick was just a stick he'd found because he liked the shape, when the sound of many footsteps arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. A group of cultivators, fully armed, spiritual energy visibly crackling around their weapons, faces set with the determination of people who have been assigned a task and intend to complete it, formed a perfect circle around Chen Ping'an, the crater, and the young woman in it. The lead cultivator stepped forward and then stopped. His expression changed. He said with the specific, careful politeness of someone who has just encountered something very much above his expected threat level and is recalibrating rapidly, "Forgive us for the interruption, Senior. We only wish to speak with the woman. We apologize for any disturbance to your cultivation." Chen Ping'an looked at the lead cultivator with genuine confusion. He had been called senior twice in 2 minutes by people who did not know him. He said, "You all do the kneeling thing a lot, don't you?" The cultivators exchanged glances. He could feel, in the way that someone who has been marinated in divine power for 5 years and still thinks it's nothing can feel such things, a particular quality to the atmosphere of the clearing. A pressure that he associated with his courtyard on cold mornings when all the animals were awake and active. He thought, they're reacting to something. He looked at his hands. Nothing unusual there from his perspective. He looked at the surrounding cultivators who were all, he noticed, sweating in weather that was not particularly warm, and whose eyes kept moving to him in a way that suggested he was the most significant thing in the clearing. He considered this. He said, "You can go." The cultivators experienced collectively what can only be described as relief so profound it was almost euphoric. They left. They left immediately. They did not stop to ask questions. They did not stop to see if the woman they'd been pursuing would escape. They were very committed to leaving. He watched them go and thought, strange behavior. He looked back at the crater. The young woman climbed out. Her robes were torn in several places, and she moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had taken a significant impact and was calculating which injuries required immediate attention. She stood, brushed herself off with dignity, and said, "My name is Mu Long Shui. I am a disciple of the Leaning Mountain Sect. You have saved my life, and I am in your debt." Chen Ping'an said, "Good timing then. I'm headed to the Leaning Mountain Sect." She stared at him. He looked back at her. Both of them were, at this precise moment, making the same incorrect assumption, that the other person was a powerful cultivator, traveling incognito, who could transport them both to their destination in seconds via flight. They established this was wrong over the next 20 minutes of increasingly awkward conversation, during which time Chen Ping'an carefully explained that he was not a cultivator and walked everywhere, and Mu Longshui carefully explained that she had exhausted her spiritual energy escaping from the people who had thrown her out of the sky. They looked at the road ahead. They looked at each other. They shrugged. They walked. Half a day of walking brought them to a mountain clearing where they stopped to rest by a stream. Mu Longshui sat cross-legged and attempted to recover her cultivation through meditation. Small streams of water curling obediently around her fingers as she worked through her techniques. She practiced water elemental cultivation, had for years, and had been stuck at a specific transition point for months. The barrier between her current level and the next felt like trying to push through wet stone. The technique was right, the intent was right, the power was there, and nothing moved. Chen Ping'an, who understood approximately nothing about cultivation theory, but was genuinely interested in watching the water do things, sat nearby and ate the last of his dried fruit, and thought about what he was going to say when he arrived at the sect with no credentials, and no cultivation, and no plan beyond following the system's instructions. After a while, he looked at Mu Longshui's water exercises and said, "You look tired." She said, "I'm fine." He said, "Do you want some water?" He offered her his flask. She took it. She drank. The water went down, and then her cultivation stirred in a way it hadn't in months. A deep internal shift, a sense of something giving way, the specific click of a barrier dissolving that cultivators describe as the most satisfying sound they have ever felt. And then she broke through. Just like that. She broke through the barrier that had held her for half a year by drinking from a flask of well water that had been in physical contact with Chen Ping'an for several hours, and had, through this proximity, accumulated enough ambient, divine energy to essentially unlock a cultivation barrier from the inside. She grabbed his hands. He noticed that she was smiling in a way that suggested something significant had happened. She said, "Senior." He said, "Yes." She said, "I don't know how to express my gratitude properly. You saved my life, and you've guided my cultivation to a breakthrough." She looked at him with the expression of someone who has made a decision. She said, "May I offer you my hand in marriage?" Chen Ping'an's face became the approximate color of the tomatoes he grew in his garden. He said, absolutely not. He said, we have met approximately 40 minutes ago. He said, you broke through because of water. She said, your water. He said, it's just water. She said, water that a mortal carries doesn't feel like that. He said, I feel like we've established I'm just a mortal, so. She said, will you accept me as your disciple instead? He said, no. She said, please. He said, you're probably older than me in cultivation terms. She said, I have a good feeling about this. He said, the feeling is coming from the breakthrough, not from any actual evidence. She said, please. He said no 3 more times. She made the face, the specific face, the one that involves large eyes and a certain quality of patient waiting. He said, I am not your master. She said, not yet. He said, at all. She said, we'll see. The system chimed, task progress updated, introduction to the Leaning Mountain Sect secured. He looked at the notification and thought, of course it counts this way. He said to no one in particular, fine. The Leaning Mountain Sect's gate was everything a cultivation sect's gate should be. Enormous, carved, spiritually charged, impressive in a way that made people walking up to it feel appropriately small. Chen Ping'an walked up to it feeling appropriately normal, which was the closest he could get. Mulong Shui had gone ahead to inform her father, Mulong Yunhai, the sect master, of what had happened, or rather of how she intended to describe what had happened, which involved careful editing of certain details and creative presentation of others. What she told him produced an expression on Mulong Yunhai's face that cycled from disbelief to curiosity to something approaching reverence. And when she finished, he said, bring him to the main courtyard. He arranged for several senior elders to be present. He then went to go find Zhang Xian, a visiting sect master from a neighboring organization, to issue the same warning. He found Zhang Xian in the guest hall and explained the situation using words that, individually, were reasonable and collectively produced an expression of polite skepticism. Zhang Xian said, a mortal. He said, yes. He said, who crossed the barrier? He said, yes. He said, by drinking water. He said, it appears so. He said, from a mortal. He said, also, yes. Zhang Xian said, with the patience of a man who has lived long enough to know when someone is either lying or has encountered something genuinely unprecedented, you believe this. Mulong Yunhai said, I've seen his cultivation level. Zhang Xian said, you can't sense the cultivation level of a mortal. Mulong Yunhai said, come outside and see. Chen Ping'an was standing in the courtyard eating a piece of dried fruit from a supply he had found at the bottom of his bag when Mulong Yunhai came around the corner and their eyes met. The moment of the sect master's perception was immediate and comprehensive and deeply, profoundly disorienting. What he saw with his cultivation-enhanced senses was not a mortal standing in a courtyard. What he saw was a Dao cyclone of enormous depth, centered on a young man holding a piece of dried fruit, spiraling into the ground beneath him and rising into the sky above him in patterns that suggested something that had been accumulating for a very long time and had arrived at a state of equilibrium that no longer needed to spiral faster because it was simply there. The density of it was, he had no frame. He had studied cultivation theory for 70 years. He had memorized descriptions from texts so ancient that reading them required a specialized technique. He had never expected to perceive what he was currently perceiving with his own senses, in his own courtyard, in a man eating fruit. He walked forward very carefully, the way you approach something that you are not certain will not notice you and react in ways you cannot predict. And he bowed. He bowed from the waist, deeply, with the formality he reserved for beings whose cultivation made his own look like the first chapter of a beginner's manual. He said, this junior greets the senior with great reverence. He said, we are honored beyond our ability to express by your presence in our sect. Chen Ping'an said, hello. He said, I'm Chen Ping'an. He said, I was hoping to join the sect. He said it with total sincerity and not a trace of performance, And Mulong Yunhai received this sentence and thought, yes, of course. Of course he has come to join the sect. What else would he do? Zhang Xian came around the corner, saw Chen Ping'an, and stopped walking. He stood completely still for approximately 3 seconds, which by his internal clock was significantly longer than it appeared from the outside, while his perception did its best to process what it was encountering. Then, with the controlled dignity of a man who has spent 60 years establishing his reputation and has in this moment decided to set it aside, he bent his knees and went to the ground. He was not certain afterward whether he had decided to do it or whether his body had simply made an executive decision. He said the words of greeting that cultivation manuals described as appropriate for encounters with the highest tier of existence. He said them very carefully. He meant all of them. Mulong Yunhai, watching from the side, had the expression of a man who is watching something extremely significant and is slightly giddy about it. Chen Ping'an said, "Please don't do that." He helped Zhang Xian up. He said, "I'm immortal." He said this with such complete sincerity that Zhang Xian temporarily entertained the possibility that the spiritual perception he had refined over 6 decades was simply broken. The small wooden ball emerged from the situation naturally, as items often emerge from situations when Chen Ping'an is present. He had been carrying it, a puzzle ball, a toy he had made for a child in the town, a piece of woodwork with an internal mechanism that had stuck shut. He mentioned that he needed to open it. He said the mechanism had jammed. He looked at the object. He looked at the kitchen knife. He used the kitchen knife to open it, which involved a single deliberate tap against the wood that produced, in the spiritual perception of both senior cultivators watching, a visual phenomenon that could only be described as 2 fundamental principles of the universe making contact and harmonizing in a visible way. Zhang Qingxian thought, that's a law-level interaction. That's 2 objects containing law-inscribed Tao principles making physical contact and the laws resonating between them. He thought, I have read theoretical descriptions of this. He thought, I have been studying cultivation for 60 years, and I have never expected to see it outside a text. He watched Chen Ping'an open the ball and look inside and say, there's candy. Who would like some candy? He thought, I need to revise several significant frameworks. He accepted a piece of candy because it seemed impolite to refuse. Mulong Yunhai accepted candy also. Mulong Shui ate hers and felt her cultivation accelerate through 7 full layers in about 40 seconds. She grabbed Chen Ping'an's hands for the 3rd time since meeting him. He said, please stop proposing. She said, I'm not proposing, I'm expressing gratitude. She was proposing. Chen Ping'an agreed to join the sect. He did not agree to be patriarch. He did not agree to be elder. He agreed to be a member, a regular member, with regular member access to the sect's facilities, and the sect masters agreed to this arrangement with the specific acceptance of people who are getting something they want under conditions that are more restrictive than they preferred, but are still enormously favorable. They agreed also to transport him home. He had asked if someone could please fly him. Both men volunteered immediately. He arrived home in approximately 5 seconds, which he said felt very fast. He thanked them. He said, come back for dinner sometime. He went inside. They stood outside his gate and breathed the ambient Tao energy of the premises and thought, each in their own way, about the precise nature of the luck that had brought them into contact with whatever this man was. They stood there for several minutes before Mulong Yunhai said, should we? And Zhang Qingxian said, yes. They started to leave. Then they saw the pond. Old Black was not trying to be visible. He was simply sleeping slightly closer to the surface than usual because the afternoon was warm, and a portion of his dorsal fin, which was approximately the size of a mature oak tree when he was at full extension, broke the surface of the water. What emerged was recognizably a fin. It was gold. It was large. It was emitting the specific spiritual frequency that corresponded to, in the theoretical literature that both these men had studied, the category primordial divine creature, 10,000-year class, gold dragon variant, currently in concealment. They stopped walking. They looked at the fin. The fin was still there. They looked at each other. They looked at the fin again. The fin sank back below the surface, slowly, with the unhurried quality of something that had not been trying to show itself and was not particularly concerned about whether it had been seen. Then the phoenix made a sound. It was a small sound. Phoenixes do not need to be loud to be fully, comprehensively, spiritually devastating. The sound it made was approximately 3 notes of a harmonic that existed in registers above and below normal human hearing simultaneously, and it resonated through every spiritual sensor both cultivators had, and then through some they had not been previously aware of having. Mu Long Yunhai's legs made a decision without consulting him. Zhang Xian was already on his knees. They knelt in the road outside Chen Ping'an's front gate and thought about their lives. After a while, Mu Long Yunhai said, "To the sky. He keeps them as pets." Zhang Qingxian said, "Yes." Mu Long Yunhai said, "The 10,000-year gold dragon is in his fish pond." Zhang Qingxian said, "Yes." Mu Long Yunhai said, "And the phoenix is in a hen cage." Zhang Qingxian said, "I heard it described as a colorful hen." Mu Long Yunhai said, with a quality in his voice that was either the beginning of laughter or the beginning of tears, "I need to go lie down." They left. They came back for dinner 3 days later because they had said they would, and because the thought of not coming back had been unacceptable from the moment it occurred to them. The dinner was stir-fried pork with vegetables, a clear broth with herbs from the garden, rice, and pickled vegetables that Chen Ping'an had made himself according to a method he'd developed over 3 years of experimentation. From his perspective, it was a straightforward meal. Good ingredients, properly cooked, nothing complicated. From the perspective of everyone at the table, it was a spiritual experience that surpassed most of the ceremonial events they had attended in their careers. The herbs from Chen Ping'an's garden had been growing in soil saturated with primordial divine energy and watered with well water from a source that ran beneath a property where the ambient Tao concentration was effectively infinite. The pork had been seasoned with a spice blend that included, without Chen Ping'an's knowledge, trace amounts of phoenix feather ash that had accumulated in his spice storage from years of proximity to the hen cage. The broth had been boiled in a pot that had been made from metal, mined near a ley line convergence point, and which had been further charged by 5 years of cooking in an environment of incomprehensible spiritual density. All of this combined to create a dish that, when consumed by cultivators whose systems were open and receptive to spiritual input, acted as a catalyst for cultivation in the way that a lifetime of formal training was supposed to act. Zhang Qingxian broke through 2 levels during the meal without particularly trying. He sat quietly with his chopsticks and thought, "I am eating dinner and advancing." He decided to eat more slowly so he could enjoy the experience. Mu Long Yunhai's son, Mu Long Gong, who had arrived uninvited and been fed anyway, broke through 1 level and then pressed his face to the table in an attempt to process the intensity of the experience. His father pretended not to notice. Mu Long Shui was eating with the focused intensity of someone who has been told a meal might improve cultivation and has decided to take this very seriously. Chen Ping'an was eating with the focused intensity of someone who was thinking about whether the broth needed more ginger. He concluded, "A little more ginger next time." He added this to his mental notes. After dinner, they all helped clean up. This was not typical post-dinner behavior for cultivators of their status, but they all did it anyway, because the domesticity of the situation had a specific quality that made it feel natural, and because none of them wanted to leave yet, and helping with dishes was a way of staying. Chen Ping'an washed. Zhang Qingxian dried. They talked about weather. It was entirely normal. It was the best evening any of them had had in years. 3 weeks after this first dinner, the situation at the Changing Moon Sect became complicated by the matter of a missing divine beast. Guo Shuyu, a young woman of considerable talent and occasionally insufficient judgment, had been responsible for the care of a fire attribute creature that had been placed under the sect's protection. Through a sequence of events that she would describe as circumstances beyond her control and that her supervisor, Zhang Lin Ni, would describe as avoidable inattention, the creature had escaped. It had flown, with the unerring instinct of divine creatures for concentrations of spiritual power, directly to the one location in the region where all standard tracking methods became useless: Chen Ping'an's property. Zhang Linni took the consequence of this professionally. The sect ancestor Yue-dong-lai, a formidable elder of enormous cultivation and correspondingly enormous opinions about responsibility, produced a whip of approximately 40 meters, and made her feelings very clear about the appropriate relationship between supervisors and the actions of those they supervised. Zhang Linni maintained her position that she had been in closed cultivation and could not be expected to prevent events occurring in her absence. The whip made several observations about this position that did not require words. Zhang Linni decided to be quiet about it. Then Guo Shiyu came back. She came back looking pleased with herself in the way that people look pleased when they have turned a disaster into an opportunity, and she said that she had not only found the creature, but had also encountered the woman who lived at the nearby property and had been given, very casually, very freely, a cultivation manual. She held it out. Yue Donglai looked at the title, The 8 Heaven Law Technique. She looked at it for a long moment with the expression of someone who was deciding whether to feel vindicated or alarmed. She opened it. She read the first section. She closed it. She said very quietly, "This is real." Guo Shiyu said, "Yes." She said, "She gave it to you." He said, "Yes." She said, "Without conditions." Guo Shiyu said, "She said she hoped it would be useful." Yue Donglai looked at the manual for another long moment. Then she did something that Guo Shiyu had never seen her do in 15 years of studying under her. She laughed. It was a brief, genuine laugh. The laugh of someone who has spent a lifetime being capable and formidable, and has just encountered something that made capability and formidability feel beside the point. She said, "All right, let's go properly introduce ourselves." Zhang Linni, still standing at the wall and being quiet about things. This seems like something that's going to significantly change how we operate. She was right. The situation that developed in parallel involved rocks. 2 rocks. The kind of rocks that look like nothing and are, in spiritual terms, the opposite of nothing. Lu Shui had purchased them at a street stall for a price that was 10,000 times too low, from a vendor wearing an unconvincing fake beard who was cheerfully unaware that he was selling divine artifacts as novelty items at market prices. Lu Shui's friend had described the rocks to him, described them with the specific precision of someone who knew exactly what they were describing, and Lu Shui had followed the description to the stall and bought them, and was now holding 2 black stones the size of fists, while everyone around him looked at the stones and then at him, with expressions that suggested they believed he had made a serious error in judgment. His companion Fang Hong pointed out that Liu Shui's family was the region's most powerful, and that presenting any gift at all at the Crown Prince's celebration would be received with appropriate gratitude. Liu Shui knew this was true. He was still nervous. The rocks did not help him be less nervous. They were very unimpressive-looking rocks. The only thing he could say in their favor was that they had been purchased from a specific stall at a specific price according to very specific instructions from a person who had never, in Liu Shui's experience, given instructions that turned out to be wrong. He held the rocks. He thought, "I am going to trust the instructions." He went to the celebration. The celebration was attended by people whose gifts reflected generations of accumulated resources and the particular desperation of wanting to impress a crown prince. There were spirit weapons, there were rare medicinal ingredients, there were cultivation manuals from lineages that no longer existed, there were artifacts that had their provenance read aloud because the provenance was more impressive than the object. There was Liu Shui, who stood in line and watched all of this and sweated slightly, and there were 2 black rocks in his hands, and when his turn came, he presented them with the confidence of a man who has decided that the decision is already made. The room went silent. Not the silence of discomfort, a different kind of silence. The specific silence that descends on a room full of cultivators when every person in it with functional spiritual perception has just registered something simultaneously and is trying to process it simultaneously and finding that processing it is not immediate. Yang Ming, the host, was at the front of the room and had the best view of what happened when the rocks entered the space. He received the spiritual signature of the rocks the way you receive a wave. Something arrived, and it moved through him, and the room around him changed quality, and he stood in the changed room and thought, "These are not rocks." He thought, "These are objects of divine function that have been allowed to look like rocks." He thought, "Someone arranged for these to be here." He thought, "I know who sent them." He accepted the rocks with both hands, which was the appropriate gesture for receiving something significant, and he said, "Extraordinary choice." He meant it without reservation. Liu Shuai, misreading the response as formal politeness, nearly left the celebration. He was prevented by Fang Hong grabbing his sleeve. The rocks were placed in a position of honor. Yang Ming spent the remainder of the celebration quietly building a theory. The theory was this: the most powerful being in the region had decided, for reasons that were probably deliberate and probably interesting, to arrange for two divine objects to appear at a crown prince's celebration through a chain of events that looked like normal commerce if you didn't look at the spiritual signatures. He thought about the cultivation master who had visited him the previous month. The master who had told him about someone operating as a mortal in the region, someone who should not be exposed or pressured, someone whose actions were always intentional even when they appeared casual. He thought about the rocks. He thought, yes, this is intentional. He did not know the full story. He was correct about the shape of it. The attempted disruption of the celebration happened from above. 3 cultivators descended from the sky with the kind of dramatic entrance that cultivation circles called making a statement. Yang Ming moved to intercept them, calculating rapidly, deciding on a defensive stance that protected the guests without escalating unnecessarily. The lead figure said, "We've come to deliver a gift. We represent the interests of a certain respected senior. We're not here for conflict." Yang Ming looked at the gift. He read the accompanying note. The note was from Yue Donglai's Sect, conveying the respects of a senior they declined to name, sending congratulations for the celebration. Yang Ming thought, this is from the same source as the rocks. He thought, they've come separately, and neither group knows about the other. He thought, this has been arranged. He accepted the gift. He thanked the visitors. He thought, I would very much like to meet whoever is orchestrating this, and I also feel that I should probably not push for that meeting. Back at Chen Ping'an's house, the doors were gone. He came home from a task run to find the door frames standing empty and a general sense that something very specific had happened while he was out. Xiaolin, his younger sister figure, a child he had taken in some months ago who was considerably more powerful than she looked and considerably less interested in discussing this than he was, described the event. A shadow figure, very fast, removed every door in the house clean off the hinges, left money. He walked to the neighbors. Same story. He walked further. Same story everywhere. He came back and sat in his doorless doorway and thought about who needed this many doors and why. He looked at Old Black in the pond. Old Black looked back. He thought, there's something here I'm not getting. He thought, the universe is doing something. He thought, I should probably wait and see what it is. He made dinner. The doorless kitchen was breezy but otherwise functional. He thought, I should probably find some way to get new doors. He thought, the money was left, so that helps. He thought, I wonder if this is a task. The system offered no clarification. It never did. Duan Xin came by that evening. She always came by in the evenings. She ran a restaurant in the town, and the evenings after service were when she had time. She had been coming by for almost 5 years, always with some food she said was left over, always with the energy of someone who has somewhere they'd rather be and is being there. She stepped over the absent doorframe without commenting on it. She sat across from him and poured tea that he had ready because he always had tea ready when she came by, and they talked about the day the way they always talked about the day. Easily, fully, without the self-consciousness that should theoretically be present between two people who were, by any outside observer's assessment, clearly something to each other that neither had named out loud yet. She said, "Everyone's doors, then." He said, "Everyone's doors." She said, "Strange." He said, "Very." She said, "Do you want to talk about it or about something else?" He said, "Something else." She said, "All right." She said, "We've known each other almost 5 years." He said, "Yes." She said, "Maybe we should change how we address each other." He looked at her. She said, "I could call you Ping'an. You could call me Xin. The small spirit creature who had attached itself to his household was watching from behind a pot of herbs on the windowsill and made a sound that conveyed strong, supportive feeling. Chen Ping'an tried the name. He said, Xin. Something moved in his memory, faint, like the feeling of standing in a room you used to live in, like reaching for a word in a language you knew as a child. He felt the shape of the name in his mouth, and felt that it was not new. He said, slowly, following something he couldn't name, "You're," he said, "Zhang Yu Xin." Duan Xin went absolutely still. The moment froze. In Chen Ping'an's perception, the ordinary afternoon light seemed to change quality, and the sound of the town outside seemed to go quiet, and everything seemed to resolve from one thing into another thing, like a picture that has been slightly out of focus snapping sharp. His mind reached towards something. Duan Xin closed her eyes. She said, to something he couldn't see, couldn't even let him do that much. She took a breath. She said, very quietly, "I'm sorry." He felt something settle over his memory. When it settled, the quality of the afternoon light was normal again, and the town sounds had resumed, and the name he'd said was already half faded, and the woman sitting across from him was Duan Xin, who had been his neighbor and friend for 5 years, and he had temporarily lost the thread of what he'd been about to say. He said, with the slightly lost quality of someone whose thought has been interrupted, "Sorry, I went somewhere." She said with complete calm, "You were asking about the door situation." He said, "Right, yes." He said, "I wonder if it's a task." She said, "Probably." He said, "The system hasn't updated." She said, "It will." He poured more tea. She held her cup with both hands. The evening continued. The small spirit creature on the windowsill watched the two of them and felt something complicated that it kept to itself. The task board updated. The instruction was, travel to a specific city, enter a refining trial, establish reputation. Secondary condition, conduct yourself as an ordinary person throughout. Reward, 1 major realm, breakthrough plus special gift. He packed his bag. He set off the next morning. On the road, about 2 hours from home, he stepped over a book lying spine up in the dirt. He picked it up. He started reading while he walked because he had discovered over 5 years that he could read while walking if the road was flat enough, which this one was. The book was a cultivation technique manual. He could tell, from context, that it had been thrown down by someone frustrated with it. The binding was wrinkled in the way of a book that has been thrown and not treated with care. He read it. He found it interesting in the way he found most things about cultivation interesting. The theory was fascinating, even if he couldn't practice it. He found several sections where the logic seemed to break down. He made notes in the margins. He added a correction to the core methodology. He added 3 supplementary techniques that seemed to follow naturally from the corrected foundation. He kept walking. By the time he reached the city, he had thoroughly annotated a technique manual in a way that would later turn out to restructure the entire understanding of a particular cultivation branch among the people who studied it, but he didn't know that yet. He was just thinking about whether the spice stall on the main road would have the kind of dried chili he liked. The trial registration was open to anyone who wanted to enter, which meant that the hall was full of people with excellent cultivation and Chen Ping'an, who had none. He took a table. He unpacked his materials, herbs from his garden, processed using methods he had developed over years of cooking, with ingredients that were considerably more spiritually active than their appearance suggested. The monitoring elder walked past his table and stopped. He looked at the materials. He looked at Chen Ping'an. He did not say anything, and continued his circuit. Chen Ping'an began working. His process was not recognizably standard. He was not using accepted refining techniques. He was using what he had, which was 5 years of developed instinct for the relationship between heat and herbs. and the specific responses of spiritually active materials to controlled processing. He was, without knowing he was doing it, using a technique that was not in any manual because it had not existed until he had needed it, and developed it in the course of 5 years of cooking in an extremely unusual household. The sabotage started from the table to his left. Grandson Zhang, third prince of the empire, had a fire control artifact he had been planning to use for some time. He activated it. 7 furnaces exploded within the next 3 minutes. The monitoring elder watched the pattern and identified the source, and watched Chen Ping'an's furnace, which had not exploded, and then watched grandson Zhang watching Chen Ping'an with an expression of frustration, and then watched Chen Ping'an's furnace temperature stabilize despite the interference, and then watched Chen Ping'an reach into the furnace and adjust something with his bare hand in a way that should not have been possible. He thought, all right. He wrote something in his records. He kept watching. The trial continued. People were eliminated. Chen Ping'an's table remained operational. The elder stood near enough to observe without interrupting. He thought, there is something happening here that I have not seen before. He found this very interesting. The furnace lid left the furnace. It departed with a sound and a velocity that suggested significant internal pressure, and grandson Zhang, watching, started to compose his expression into satisfaction, and then the lid kept going upward, and Chen Ping'an reached into the space where the lid had been, and pulled out 2 pills and held them in his hands, and looked at them with the expression of someone who has produced a thing and is genuinely curious whether it's correct. He walked to the elder. He said, "Are these all right?" The elder took them. He held them up. He looked at them for a long moment. He said, "Both of these are flawless." He said, "I've been administering this trial for 30 years. He said, "I have never seen flawless pills emerge from this combination of inputs." He said, "I'm going to need a moment to revise my understanding of what the ceiling on this trial is." Chen Ping'an said, "So that's a yes?" The elder said, "Yes, that is very much a yes." Grandson Zhang came forward. He said, "This is impossible." He said, "The pills were planted." He said, "A pill cannot emerge from an exploding furnace." He said several more things along these lines, each one delivered with the conviction of someone who believes that enough certainty will make reality comply. The elder listened. He said, "The furnace seals are standard trial issue and were inspected this morning." He said, "No external object can enter or exit during the trial without setting off the detection formations." He said, "What you observed is what occurred." Grandson Zhang said, "Then let him do it again." He said, "With these materials." He produced a container. He said, "If you're as capable as you appear, these should be no obstacle." He was smiling with the confidence of someone who has loaded the container with an incompatible material combination that will produce a guaranteed detonation upon contact. The elder looked at the container. He looked at Chen Ping'an. He gave a very small nod that communicated, "Proceed, this is part of the trial." Chen Ping'an looked at the materials. He picked them up one by one and smelled them, which was not a standard assessment technique but which served the same function in his case. He noticed the irregular one. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at the elder's nod. He thought, the elder knows. He thought, but the elder isn't stopping it. He thought, this is probably a test. He thought, I'm supposed to deal with it rather than point it out. He thought, the question is how to deal with it. He began refining. He handled the incompatible element by processing it first and separately, integrating it into the blend at a stage where its reactive properties were neutralized by the specific sequence of temperature changes he applied. This was not a technique from any manual. It was a procedure he had developed in his kitchen during an incident involving Old Black's pond water getting into the herb storage and making everything react strangely for 2 weeks, during which time he had learned a great deal about managing incompatible elements in combination. The furnace built pressure. It released. The result emerged, 2 pills, better than the first. He handed them to the elder and waited. The elder held them and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "These are better than the first ones." He said this in a tone of voice that suggested the sentence was accurate but did not come close to capturing the full situation. He wrote something in his records. He said, Your result stands. Grandson Zhang said, wait. He opened the box he was carrying. He said, this is a real breakthrough pill. He said, what this candidate produced is not. He said, there is a clear quality difference and I can demonstrate it to anyone with sufficient perception. He said it with the tone of someone playing a final card. The elder looked at both pills for a moment. He looked at Chen Ping'an. He said, I believe we've been unclear about what I'm holding. He said, the pill in my right hand, yours, grandson, is a standard breakthrough pill. It will help someone cross a minor bottleneck under appropriate conditions. He said, the pill in my left hand, this candidate's, has no appropriate conditions requirement. It contains no restriction on the consumer's current state or realm. It will provide a direct major realm breakthrough to anyone who takes it, regardless of where they currently are in their cultivation. He said, I'm not aware of a category name for a pill of this specification. He said, the comparison you invited me to make concludes as follows. This is not a breakthrough pill. This is something that breakthrough pills aspire to be. The room was silent. Grandson Zhang said nothing. The elder called the results. The trial closed. Chen Ping'an had placed first. He gave the extraordinary pill to the elder and told him to give it to whoever needed it most. He said, I can't use it. He said, I don't have cultivation. He said, someone who has cultivation should have it. He said these things without drama and without performance, and walked away from the trial hall into the afternoon. The elder stood with the pill in his hands and thought about what he had just witnessed, and thought about what kind of person hands away the most valuable object in the room, because it would be wasted on them, and said so simply, and then left. He thought about this for a long time. He gave the pill to Wan Xiaojun because the elder had seen them interact and had drawn the correct conclusion, and it turned out to be exactly right. Chen Ping'an walked back toward the main street and found a book in the road. He picked it up, which was something he did automatically with books because they seemed like things that shouldn't be left in roads. He read it while walking. He found it interesting and flawed and began annotating it, which was something he did with books when he found them interesting and flawed. He was doing this when Zhou Xiaoming appeared beside him and stopped walking and stared at the open page. Zhou Xiaoming was the son of the crown prince, one of the empire's acknowledged 3 great geniuses, and he had been trying to learn the technique in the book Chen Ping'an was annotating for 3 years, without success. He read the annotations. He said, "May I have this when you're done?" Chen Ping'an said, "I'm done now." He handed it over. He said, "Is there anything useful you can tell me about the area in exchange?" Zhou Xiaoming told him several things. One of them turned out to be exactly what Chen Ping'an needed to know. They parted. Zhou Xiaoming sat down in the road and read the annotated manual for the next hour and then began practicing the revised technique with the ease of someone for whom a door that had been stuck has simply opened, and he thought, who was that person? The fight with grandson Zhang's people happened on a side street when Chen Ping'an was not expecting it. 6 cultivators, significant spiritual power. He looked at them and thought, this is the point where I should be frightened. He performed an internal check. He was not frightened. He thought about why not. He thought, probably 5 years of living with a gold dragon and a phoenix has adjusted my calibration for what counts as dangerous. He thought, these young men have good cultivation. They are not a gold dragon. The leader said, you embarrass the 3rd prince. Chen Ping'an said, I was just doing the task. He said, I didn't mean to embarrass anyone. The leader said, that's not how it works. Chen Ping'an said, I understand. He had, during this conversation, been thinking about the body technique he'd been developing from the book annotations, and without particularly deciding to, he started using it. It felt like moving through his garden, following the paths of least resistance, stepping between the forces rather than against them. He stepped sideways. He stepped sideways again. He realized, considerably harder to hit than the situation should have warranted. He thought, the book said this technique was about reading flows and moving in the spaces between them. He thought, I've been doing exactly that in the garden for 5 years. He thought, interesting. He kept not being hit for several minutes, finding it educational until the task completed and the system said, finished. He stood in the aftermath and looked at his hands and thought, I should practice that more. He picked up his bag. He continued. He had a long walk home and was thinking about dinner. The new doors were installed when he returned. Clean wood, good craftsmanship, properly hung. No explanation left. He walked through the kitchen and into the courtyard and looked at the pond and said, "Old Black." Old Black surfaced slightly, which for a 10,000-year gold dragon was the equivalent of a full conversation. He said, "Thank you, I think." Old Black sank back down. The phoenix made a small warm sound from the backyard. He thought, they arranged the doors. He thought, obviously they arranged the doors. He thought, the whole door situation was them. He thought, why? He thought about this for a while and reached the conclusion that there was probably a reason and that it probably served a purpose that he didn't fully understand yet, and that was fine. He went inside. Xin was already there with Shaolin, making dinner. They had been doing this more and more, the three of them making dinner together in the evenings, and he had stopped trying to articulate why it felt so specifically right and had just let it be right. He sat at the table. Shaolin told him about her day. Xin told him about hers. He told them about the trial and the book and the fight and the city without mentioning anything that would have been alarming. They ate. The food was excellent. Afterward, they talked for a while about nothing important. And then Xin went home and Shaolin went to bed, and Chen Ping'an sat alone in the kitchen with the lamp and thought about the day. He thought, I am, by every standard I can apply, a normal person in an abnormal world. He thought, I cannot cultivate. I cannot sense spiritual energy. I cannot fly. I can do exactly one extraordinary thing, which is complete tasks set by a system I don't understand, and in the process of doing those tasks, I occasionally do things that cultivators find inexplicable, but only because they're seeing an ordinary person apply ordinary knowledge in a context where ordinary people are not expected to exist. He thought, that's all I am. He thought, I'm very sure that's all I am. He thought this with the complete sincerity of someone who has never been more wrong about something. Outside, Old Black circled slowly in the pond, keeping watch. The phoenix had settled into her roosting position with her eyes still open, attending to things humans couldn't see. The kitchen knife, resting on the counter where he'd left it, was very still and very watchful in the way of things that understand situations from the inside. The small spirit creature was asleep on the windowsill. The house was full of things that knew exactly what Chen Ping'an was, and were waiting, with the patience of the very old and the very powerful, for him to figure it out. They had been waiting for 5 years. They could wait more. They had, all of them in their different ways, decided that the waiting was the point. That Chen Ping'an arriving at the truth at his own pace, in his own time, was the condition under which the truth would be worth knowing. Xin knew this. She was managing it carefully, day by day, moment by moment. The system knew this, in the way that systems know things. The universe knew this and found it, as it found everything about Chen Ping'an, extremely funny and also, unexpectedly, very tender. He blew out the lamp and went to bed. Tomorrow there would be tasks. Tomorrow there would be something that didn't make sense that he would handle anyway because that's what he did. Tomorrow Xin would come by in the evening and they would have tea and he would feel the faint edge of something he couldn't quite name, and the small spirit creature would watch from the windowsill and Old Black would drift in the pond, and the phoenix would make her small warm sound, and the house that was full of things beyond counting would hold its breath and wait for the moment when the man at the center of all of it stopped believing the thing he had been allowed to believe and started knowing the thing that everyone else in his life already knew. It was coming. He could feel the shape of it sometimes, in the way you feel weather before it arrives. He reached for it sometimes and found it just out of reach. He had been reaching for it for 5 years. One day, very soon, his hand would close around it, and on that day, the 10,000-year gold dragon in his pond would finally be allowed to surface. The phoenix would sing. The kitchen knife would vibrate with something that, in a human, would be called joy. And Duan Xin, who was Zhang Xin, who had been waiting longer than any of them, would look at the face of the person she had crossed realities to find, and would think, "There you are, finally, there you are." But that day was not today. Today he slept. The house watched over him, and the universe, which had been arranging all of this with the patience of something that has done it before and knows how it ends, turned another page. The days that followed operated on a rhythm that Chen Ping'an had settled into so thoroughly over 5 years that it felt like weather, something that simply was, rather than something he had constructed. He woke early. He tended the garden, which meant talking to Old Black, who surfaced partially to acknowledge him the way a person in bed acknowledges morning. He harvested what needed harvesting, and noticed what needed attention, and occasionally found himself explaining agricultural problems to the Phoenix as if she might have opinions, which she did, in the specific way that ancient beings have opinions, through attention rather than words. He cooked breakfast. He checked the task board. He went out, and every day, without fail, something happened that defied his expectations, and every day, without fail, he handled it with the specific pragmatic calm of someone who has accepted that the world they live in is not the world they expected, and has decided that accepting this is more useful than objecting to it. The day after returning from the city, the task was simple. Visit a specific shop in the lower market district and make a purchase. He read this twice, because it seemed almost too ordinary, and then he went. The shop was a general goods stall run by an old man named Lao Dan, who had been practicing medicine on the side for 60 years without formal certification, and who had, in his 60 years of informal practice, accumulated a set of notebooks full of observations that no formal medical text contained. Lao Dan was in his shop when Chen Ping'an arrived, reading one of these notebooks with the absorbed attention of a man still finding his own notes interesting after 6 decades. He looked up when the door opened. He said with the directness of someone who had stopped having time for preamble, "You're him." Chen Ping'an said, "Probably." Lao Dan said, "I've been expecting you." He said, "Not specifically expecting you." He said, "I've been expecting someone." He looked at Chen Ping'an for a moment and then said, "You're not sick, are you?" Chen Ping'an said, "No, I just came to buy something." He said, the task didn't specify what. He realized a beat late that mentioning the task was odd. Lao Dan looked at him. He said, "Task." Chen Ping'an said, "I have a system." He said, "It gives me things to do." Lao Dan said, "Does it?" He looked at Chen Ping'an for a moment longer, and then put down the notebook, and stood up and went to the back of the shop and came back with a small jar. He set it on the counter. He said, "This." Chen Ping'an said, "What is it?" Lao Dan said, "I've been making it for 40 years. He said, "Nobody buys it because it looks ordinary." He said, "It's not ordinary." He said, "You might need it later." He said, "The price is telling me what you think of this." Chen Ping'an looked at the jar. He looked at Lao Dan. He said, "I think it's important." He said, "I think you made it because someone needed it and you didn't know yet who." He said, "I think the fact that I'm here means I'm the person who's supposed to have it." Lao Dan was quiet for a moment. He said, "That'll do." He said, "No charge." He handed over the jar. The system notification said, "Task complete. Reward. Cultivation Insight Fragment." Chen Ping'an thanked him and left. Outside, he looked at the jar. It looked like a jar. He put it in his bag. He would figure out what it was when it became relevant. He had learned in 5 years that things became relevant when they needed to. The encounter with the faction of young cultivators who had been following him since the city trial happened on the 3rd Street of the upper market, which was not a great place for a confrontation, because it was busy at midday and the stalls were close together. He had been buying dried chili when he noticed them. 6 of them, distributed at what they probably thought were casual intervals, all watching him with the specific attention of people who have a plan and are waiting for their moment. He looked at them. He looked at his dried chili. He bought the dried chili. He turned around. He said, to the nearest one, "Can I help you?" The young man looked surprised that he had been addressed directly. The others converged. There was a certain amount of preamble from their leader about reputation and consequences, and the appropriate behavior of mortals who had embarrassed important people. Chen Ping'an listened. He thought about what he had learned in the city about the body technique. He thought about the body technique. He thought, there are 6 of them, and they have good cultivation, and I have dried chili and the annotated body technique that I have been practicing in my head for 2 days. He said, I understand your position. He said, I don't have a good alternative solution to offer you right now, so I'm going to ask you to give me a moment and then I'll respond. They thought this was some kind of formal preliminary. It was actually Chen Ping'an buying himself approximately 12 seconds to run through the body technique theory one more time and confirm he understood the core principle. He said, all right. He started moving. The thing about the body technique, as he had understood it from the annotation and the supplementary work he'd added to the manual, was that it didn't generate force to oppose force. It redirected. It found the spaces in the pattern of incoming motion and occupied them. It was, he thought while executing it, basically the same thing he did when navigating the town market on a busy day, which he'd been doing for 5 years. He was good at navigating the market on busy days. The 6 young cultivators found that hitting him was considerably harder than they had anticipated. He moved between them with the unhurried quality of someone who is doing something they understand. The system updated. Reputation points. Secondary task complete. He stopped moving. They were not injured, but they were not in positions they had planned to be in. He said, I think we're done here. He bought another bag of chili while they sorted themselves out. He went home. Xiaolin had made soup. He came in from the market and the house smelled like ginger and the comfortable warmth of something that had been simmering patiently. And he set down his bags and looked around the kitchen and thought, this is a very good smell to come home to. Xiaolin appeared from behind the curtain that separated the kitchen from the main room, looked at him with the expression she wore when she had done something she was privately proud of but would not say so directly, and said, sit down. He sat. She brought soup. The soup was extraordinary, not in the way that Chen Ping'an's cooking was extraordinary, which was an unconscious absorption of ambient divine energy into ingredients that had been cultivated in soil, that had been blessed 1,000 ways over, but in a different way. It had clarity. Every flavor was precisely itself, and also inseparably part of the whole, and the balance between them was the kind of balance that takes decades to develop in a cook, and Xiaolin had been cooking for approximately 3 months. He ate it and thought, she's better than me at this. He ate it and thought, considerably better than me at this. He ate it and thought, I should be bothered by this, and I'm not, actually. He said, this is excellent. She sat across from him with her bowl and said, I know. He looked at her. She looked at him. He thought, she is 12 years old and she arrived at my door about 4 months ago, and I have no information about her background or her family, and she occasionally emits spiritual pressure that would make senior cultivators excuse themselves from the room, and she makes better soup than I do. And she calls me Big Brother, and I have simply decided that this is my family now. He thought, I think this might be one of the best decisions I've ever made. He ate 3 bowls. She was mildly pleased in the way that very capable people are mildly pleased when their capability is acknowledged without excess fuss. The 2 old cultivators who had been coming for dinner twice a week since the first meal were Mulong Yunhai and Zhang Xian, and they had, over the past few weeks, begun bringing people. Not many at a time, 1 extra at most, always described as someone who happened to be visiting, always introduced with the studied casualness of people who are doing something with intention and pretending they aren't. The extra people arrived and had dinner and experienced some version of what the original 2 had experienced, which was a meal that was a spiritual event described as a meal. And they left with their cultivation having done something it hadn't done in a while. And they came back. Chen Ping'an noticed this pattern. He noticed that the dinner table was gradually getting larger. He noticed that he was cooking more. He thought, these 2 old men are using my dining table as a cultivation venue and are bringing people. He thought, I should probably say something about this. He said nothing, because the truth was, he didn't mind. He liked cooking for people. He liked the table being full. He liked the way these evenings felt, crowded and warm and full of conversations that went in unexpected directions and ended later than anyone intended. He thought, this is probably a task somehow. The system remained silent on this point. He decided to count it as optional and acceptable. It was during one of these dinners that the situation with the music began. He had a flute. He had found it in his house on the third year, tucked behind a cabinet, probably left by a previous occupant, made from a bamboo species he didn't recognize that felt warm to the touch and resonated slightly against his palm. He had played it occasionally in the evenings when the house was quiet, mostly to practice, mostly because he liked the sound. He had not thought about what the flute was. He had thought about it the way he thought about most things in his house, which was, nice object, glad it's here, moving on. He played it one evening when the dinner table had not yet cleared, 4 guests still sitting over tea, winding down from the evening, and he played a piece that had no name because he had made it up, moving through a sequence of notes that felt right the way following a path feels right when you've walked it enough times. The effect on the dinner table was immediate and comprehensive. Everyone at the table went still. The cultivators' perceptions sharpened involuntarily. They could feel the music in their meridians, feel it resonating through the pathways of their cultivation, in the same way a tuning fork resonates through the objects nearby. It was not aggressive. It was not demanding. It was simply present in a way that very clear, very certain things are present, and its presence caused things to align that had been slightly misaligned. Mulong Shui, who had been struggling with a specific point in her cultivation for the previous week, felt the point resolved during the second verse. Zhang Xian's cultivation, which had been integrating the recent breakthroughs at a pace he found slightly unsatisfying, accelerated measurably. Everyone at the table felt, in their own way, a version of the same thing. The musical equivalent of a window opening in a room that had been slightly too warm. After the piece ended, the table was quiet for a moment. Mulong Yunhai said, "That was very pleasant." He said it with the specific restraint of a man who is experiencing significant emotion and has decided that the socially correct response is understatement. Chen Ping'an said, "Thanks, I've been working on it." He said, "I think the second section is still a bit awkward." He set the flute down. He asked if anyone wanted more tea. The next day someone arrived who had heard about the flute. He heard about it the way people hear about things that happen at private dinners, indirectly, through a chain of impression that started with a guest who mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone who mentioned it at a gathering where the right person was listening. The right person, in this case, was Mulong Gong, the son of the Sect master, who had been continuing to think about the dinner he had attended weeks ago, and about the music he had heard described, and who had decided, with the directness that Mulong Yunhai's children apparently inherited, to simply come and ask to hear it. He arrived at Chen Ping'an's door without announcement. He knocked on the door that had been replaced and introduced himself and said, "I heard you play an instrument," he said. "Would you mind playing something?" Chen Ping'an said, "Sure." He played something. Mulong Gong sat in the doorway and listened, and then sat on the step and listened, and then sat in the courtyard for the next hour, while Chen Ping'an played and stopped and played again, and occasionally frowned slightly at a sequence that wasn't right and revised it and played again. By the end of it, Mulong Gong's cultivation had advanced in 2 separate areas simultaneously, and he had experienced a qualitative shift in his understanding of a technique he had been practicing for years, that he could only describe as suddenly seeing something that had always been there, but that he hadn't been looking at correctly. He stood up when Chen Ping'an set the flute down. He said, "I want to pay you for that." Chen Ping'an said, "No thank you," he said. "You listened nicely. That's enough." Mulong Gong looked at him for a moment and then said, "You really mean that?" Chen Ping'an said, "Yes." He said, "Come back if you want to hear more." He said, "Bring the tea next time, I'm running low." Mulong Gong went home. He told his father. His father looked at the ceiling for a moment and thought, "He told my son to bring tea." He said, "I'll send some over." He sent 3 cases. Chen Ping'an looked at 3 cases of extremely high-quality tea and thought, "That's more tea than I can drink in a year." He wrote a note saying, "Thank you, it was too much, and please take some back." The tea stayed. The situation with the spirit creature in the storage room became untenable around the 5th week. The creature, which Chen Ping'an had brought home thinking it was an injured animal, had been hiding very successfully behind the rice sacks, surviving on food scraps and ambient spiritual energy, and the hope that it would not be noticed. It had been noticed. Old Black had noticed it on day 1. The Phoenix had noticed it on day 2. The kitchen knife had noticed it immediately. The small spirit creature on the windowsill had been noticing it for weeks, with an expression of amused tolerance. The creature in the storage room was aware it had been noticed by all of these things, and was attempting to navigate the impossible situation of being a minor spirit entity in a household that contained a 10,000-year gold dragon and a phoenix and several divine artifacts, all of whom could end its existence as a casual side project, and was doing so through the method of being extremely small and extremely still, and hoping that the policy of benign neglect would extend indefinitely. It had survived. Until Xiaolin opened the storage room for rice and looked directly at it. The creature froze. Xiaolin looked at it. She said, "You've been there a while." It said nothing. She said, "Are you hungry?" It said nothing, because it was not certain whether answering was better or worse than continued silence. She held out a small piece of something from her pocket. It took the piece of something. She nodded. She got the rice and left. The creature sat with the small piece of food and thought, "This household is incomprehensible." It ate the food. It was very good. It started coming out in the evenings when Xiaolin was in the kitchen. Chen Ping'an noticed the creature eventually, not because it emerged, but because it left tiny evidence of its passage in ways he began to recognize. Small reorganizations of objects, traces of its particular spiritual signature that were unfamiliar, and therefore noticeable once he had context for them. He asked Xiaolin. She said, "It's been here a while." She said it seemed hungry. She said, "I gave it some things." He looked at the storage room. He said, "It's welcome to stay if it wants." She said, "I told it that already." He said, "Good." He thought, "This household has developed a completely informal immigration policy, and I am the last to know." He thought, "That seems correct, actually." He went to make dinner. The meeting with Zhang Qingxian's father, or rather the meeting that Zhang Qingxian's father forced him to refuse, was the one that the sect found hardest to explain. Zhang Xiaofeng was a legendary figure, the founder of the Changing Moon Sect's current lineage, a cultivator of generations-spanning power who had been in secluded cultivation for decades and had emerged recently with the specific intention of meeting someone that Zhang Qingxian had been sending increasingly excited messages about. He arrived at the Changing Moon Sect expecting to be taken to this extraordinary person. Zhang Qingxian took him. They traveled to Chen Ping'an's town. They arrived. Chen Ping'an was chopping firewood. Zhang Xiaofeng, who had perceived on approach that the property they were walking toward contained spiritual signatures that suggested the presence of at least 3 beings of mythological status, plus a background field of Tao energy so dense it was essentially a natural environment at this point, arrived in the lane outside the house and looked at Chen Ping'an chopping firewood and had a spiritual experience that he would later describe to Zhang Qingxian using the word indescribable, which was technically accurate and also completely uninformative. Chen Ping'an looked up. He said, "Hello." Zhang Xiaofeng, who had in his long life perceived, measured, and integrated essentially every category of spiritual power known to cultivation theory, stood in the lane and experienced something that he had no framework for, and which he could only characterize as encountering, in the form of a person chopping firewood, something that existed outside the categories he had spent his life building. He said after a moment, "I'm told you prefer to be considered ordinary." Chen Ping'an said, "I am ordinary." Zhang Xiaofeng said, "Of course." He said, "May we come in for tea?" Chen Ping'an said, "Sure." He said, "I'm running low on tea, but there should be enough for 1 pot." Zhang Xiaofeng said, "We'll bring some next time." He said this with complete certainty. Chen Ping'an said, "All right." He put down the axe. They went inside. The tea that was left, brewed in Chen Ping'an's kitchen in his pot with his water, was sufficient to advance Zhang Xiaofeng's cultivation in a way that he had been attempting for the previous 11 years and had concluded was probably not achievable in his current state. He sat with his cup and thought, 11 years, and I did it over tea. He thought, I need to revise several assumptions I have been operating on. He said, very politely, that the tea was excellent. Chen Ping'an said, it's just the water. He said, the well in the courtyard has good water. Zhang Xiaofeng thought about the well. He thought about what kind of water accumulates in a well that is sunk in property like this. He said, yes. He said, the water is very good. It was around this time that something happened at a major distance from the small town, but which had direct implications for it. A cultivation sect of significant power had sent operatives to investigate the spiritual anomalies reported in the region. The unnatural density of Tao energy, the reports of breakthrough events associated with what should have been ordinary food and drink and music, the accounts of cultivators of various levels experiencing advancement after contact with a specific location. The operatives were professionals. They knew how to locate spiritual concentrations. They tracked the readings to the small town. They tracked the readings within the small town to a particular street. They tracked the readings to a particular house with a pond in the front courtyard. One of them thought, this must be a formation. A formation of this density would represent the work of a master artificer of extraordinary ability. He began analyzing the structure of it. The analysis produced results that were incoherent. He ran the analysis again. The results were still incoherent. He consulted with his colleagues. Their analyses also produced incoherent results. They convened at a distance from the house and discussed this. They concluded that either the formation was of a type they had not encountered, or that what they were measuring was not a formation. If it was not a formation, they would need to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about what could produce these readings. One of the operatives, who had been watching the house during the discussion, said very quietly, there's a man in there. He said, I can see him through the window. He said, he appears to be cooking. The group looked at the window. Through it, they could see Chen Ping'an moving around a kitchen, doing things with a pot and a cutting board, exhibiting no awareness of being observed, and emitting, each operative confirmed this independently, the Tao signature that their instruments had tracked here. The operative who had started the formation analysis said, that's the formation. Another one said, that's a person. The first one said, I know. The conversation stopped. After a while, the senior operative said, we'll report what we've measured. We'll leave the interpretation to higher levels. They left. None of them mentioned in their reports what they had seen through the window, because it seemed like the kind of information that would cause problems for everyone involved. There was a young man named Guo Shuyu, different person from Guo Shuyu of the Changing Moon Sect, confusingly, who had heard about Chen Ping'an from a cousin who had been at a dinner and who had decided, with the casual confidence of someone who had been told he was talented since birth, that he would like to investigate. He arrived at the house without introduction, knocked, and when Chen Ping'an opened the door, said, I heard you do something with music that affects cultivation. He said, I'd like to hear. Chen Ping'an said, all right. He said, come in. The young man came in. He sat in the main room while Chen Ping'an found the flute. He said, while Chen Ping'an was looking, I should tell you that I'm considered one of the more promising young cultivators in the region. He said, my cultivation is currently at the... He named a level that was by any standard impressive. He said, I mention this because I want you to understand I'm not here out of desperation. He said, I'm curious, not needy. Chen Ping'an came back with the flute. He said, that's fine. He said, do you want tea first? The young man said, no, thank you. Chen Ping'an played. The young man sat and listened and then stopped sitting and went very still in the way of someone whose body has made a decision that the mind hasn't caught up to yet. And then something happened in his cultivation that he would describe later as, like hearing a song you've been trying to remember for years, and finally remembering it. He sat quietly with this for a while after the music stopped. He said, you're not ordinary. Chen Ping'an said, I think I am. The young man said, then I think you're measuring wrong. He said, thank you. He left. He came back 3 days later with a very good set of tea things and said, now I'd like the tea first. Chen Ping'an made tea. They talked. The young man came back every few days after that, and Chen Ping'an never asked why, and never commented on the pattern, and the young man never explained it, and this was satisfactory to both of them. Xin came by that evening as she always did, and this time she brought food from the restaurant. Things she said were leftovers, but that were, as always, exactly the things he would have wanted. They sat in the kitchen after dinner while Xiaolin was in the next room with the spirit creature, who had taken to the small room off the main hall and seemed to find it acceptable. And they talked about small things, and then about larger things, moving between them the way that people do when they have the time and the ease to let conversation find its own level. She said, "Do you remember much about before?" He said, "Before I came here?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Some things." He said, "It's blurry around the edges." He said, "I remember the feeling of things more than the details." He said, "Why?" She said, "I was curious." She said, "You seem like you were happy before." He thought about this. He said, "I think I was." He said, "I think I had a good life." He said, "I don't know why I left it." She looked at her tea. She said, "Maybe you didn't leave." He said, "What?" She said, "Maybe you were brought." He thought about this. He said, "By whom?" She said, "I don't know." She said it carefully. She said, "Maybe by someone who thought this was the right place for you." He looked at her. She was looking at her tea. He said, "Do you think that's possible?" She said, "I think the world is full of things that are arranged rather than accidental." He said, "Is that from somewhere?" She said, "Just something I've been thinking." He said, "It's a good thought." She said, "Yes." They were quiet for a while. The kitchen lamp made its small warm light. Outside, Old Black was doing something in the pond that caused small gold ripples that were visible through the kitchen window if you were looking. He was not looking. She was. She watched the gold ripples and thought, "Not yet, but soon." She looked up. He was looking at her. He looked away. She thought, "Soon." The visit from the being that called itself Lord of 10,000 came with more warning than most of the unexpected things that arrived at Chen Ping'an's house, in that there was a significant atmospheric disturbance several hours before the being itself arrived. The sky above the small town developed qualities that it did not normally have: a pressure, a clarity, a sense of something very large paying attention. And several of the cultivators who had been using Chen Ping'an's dinner table as their unofficial cultivation venue arrived at his house in a state of elevated alertness that they were trying to present as ordinary afternoon visiting. Chen Ping'an made tea. He thought, "Something is happening." He thought, "I don't know what." He thought, "It will probably become clear." He was right. The being arrived as a column of light that condensed on his front path and became a figure that was humanoid in form and radiated the specific quality of something that had been operating at the transcendent level for long enough to have stopped thinking about it. It looked at Chen Ping'an's house. It looked at the pond. Its expression changed. It looked at the chicken in the backyard. Its expression changed again. It looked at Chen Ping'an, who was standing in his doorway with a cup of tea, and the calm expression of someone who has been surprised by things in his own home for 5 years and has made peace with it. The being said very carefully, "I see." Chen Ping'an said, "Hello." He said, "Would you like tea?" The being looked at him for a long moment. It said, "I was told you traveled here from another world." It said, "I was told you have no cultivation." Chen Ping'an said, "Both of those are true." The being said, "And this is your house?" Chen Ping'an said, "Yes." The being looked at the house. It looked at the gold dragon in the pond, who had surfaced slightly in response to the visitor's arrival, and was regarding the being with the ancient calm attention of something that has been around longer than most things. It looked at the phoenix, who was making the specific sound that phoenixes make when they are observing something they find interesting. It looked at the kitchen knife, which was absolutely still and absolutely present in the way of things that could end you and had chosen not to. It said to Chen Ping'an, "Have you been here since the beginning?" He said, "About 5 years." It said, "And you've never..." He said, "I can't cultivate." It said, "That's what I mean." He said, "Yes." It said, "All right." It said, "I would like the tea." He let it in. He made tea. The being drank tea in his kitchen and thought about the nature of mortals who accumulate impossible things by accident and whether this was accident or something else, and reached a conclusion that it kept to itself. When it left, it said, "I'll come back." He said, "You're welcome." He said, "Bring something next time." He said, "We're always short on something." It looked at him one more time and then it left. He closed the door. He went back to making dinner. The kitchen knife vibrated very slightly on the counter, which was its way of laughing. The accumulation of these events, the dinner table expanding, the music listeners arriving, the operatives departing confused, the ancient being drinking tea, the storage room creature emerging, the flute being played in the evenings, the tasks completed quietly one by one, built towards something that was felt before it was seen. Chen Ping'an felt it as a kind of pressure that was not uncomfortable, but was present, like standing near a window on a windy day. He felt it in the quality of his sleep, which had become vivid in ways it hadn't been before. Not quite dreams, more like the feeling of being on the edge of remembering something. He felt it in the moments when he looked at Xin across the table, and had the sense that the name he was using for her was not all of her name. He felt it in Old Black's increasing visibility, the dragon surfacing more often, staying at the surface longer, watching him with an attention that felt more deliberate than it used to. He felt it in the phoenix's song, which had been occurring more frequently, and which he had started to find actively moving in a way he hadn't before, though he couldn't have said why. He thought, something is coming. He thought, I don't know what. He thought, I suppose I'll find out when it arrives. It arrived on a morning that looked like every other morning. Clear sky, good light, the garden doing what it always did, Old Black at the surface, the phoenix settled in her yard. He was making breakfast when the system activated in a different way than it ever had before. Not a task, not a notification, something closer to, the previous conditions have been met. He stood in the kitchen and felt this, not as words, more as a lifting of something that had been there so long he had stopped noticing it. And he set down the pot and went out to the courtyard. He stood in the courtyard in the morning light. He looked at the pond. He looked at the garden. He looked at the house he had been living in for 5 years. He thought, I have always thought this was ordinary. He thought, I have been living in this house for 5 years, and I have always thought it was ordinary, and I have never, not once, actually looked at it and seen what was there. He looked. He saw. Old Black surfaced completely, for the first time. The full length of the dragon emerged from the pond with the slow, deliberate majesty of something that has been waiting for a moment that has finally arrived. 10,000 years of age and power resolved from a large fish into what it actually was. A gold dragon of extraordinary size, each scale the color of morning sunlight, coiled in the space of the courtyard with a presence that rewrote the quality of the air around it. It looked at Chen Ping'an. Chen Ping'an looked at it. He said, Old Black. It said for the first time, yes. He said, you can talk. It said, I have always been able to talk. He said, you're a dragon. It said, yes. He said, you've been in my pond for 5 years. It said, yes. He said, you're a 10,000-year gold dragon. It said, yes. He said, and you've been pretending to be a large fish. It said, yes. He said, why? It said, you needed a quiet home. He said, I didn't specifically need a gold dragon for a quiet home. It said, you needed someone to watch over the home. He said, I didn't specifically know I needed that either. It said, you did though. He thought about this. He said, where did you come from actually? It said, that's a long answer. He said, we have time. It said, yes. It said, we do. It settled in the courtyard in a way that suggested it had been wanting to properly inhabit the space for some time and was now allowing itself to. The phoenix made a sound from the backyard. The kitchen knife vibrated on the counter inside. The spirit creature poked its head out of the storage room. Shaolin appeared in the doorway of the house and looked at the dragon and said, you finally came out. She looked at Chen Ping'an and said, I wondered when this would happen. He said, you knew? She said, I'm 12, not oblivious. She said, breakfast is ready. She went back inside. He stood in the courtyard with a 10,000-year gold dragon and thought, I have been wrong about my life in the most comprehensive way possible, and I am standing in my courtyard at morning, and the sun is exactly right, and breakfast is ready, and someone I love is inside, and I think, despite everything, I am very happy. Old Black said, yes. He said, breakfast. They went inside. Xin came by that evening. She came by and knocked on the door, and he opened it, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and this time, with whatever had shifted in the morning still present, still active, still rearranging his understanding of what was what, the name that surfaced in his mind when he saw her face was not the name he had been using for 5 years. He said, He stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her expression was very still. He said, Xin. She said, yes. He said, that's not all of your name. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, no. He said, I feel like I should know the rest of it. She said very quietly, you do. He said, what if I told you? He stopped. He said, what if I said? He looked at her. She waited. The whole house was very still. He said, Zhang Yu Xin. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears, and she was smiling in a way that was too big for her face, in the way that people smile when something they have been holding for a very long time is finally allowed to set down its weight. She said, yes. He said, you followed me here. She said, yes. He said, She said, yes. He said, how long? She said, longer than you know. He thought about 5 years. He thought about what it must have taken. He said, you managed this whole time? She said, it wasn't easy. She said, but I wasn't going to not find you. He thought about that. He thought about the way she came by every evening and always had exactly the right food, and always knew what he was going to say before he said it, and always looked at him with something in her expression that he had noticed for 5 years without knowing what to call it. He said, I've been calling you Boss Duan. She said, I know. He said, for 5 years. She said, I know. He said, that must have been. She said, a little. He said, I'm sorry. She said, don't be. She said, you were exactly where you were supposed to be. He looked at her standing in the doorway and felt 5 years of ordinary evenings rearrange themselves into their actual shape, which was her choosing this consistently every day because she had decided and was not the kind of person who changed her mind. He said, come in. She came in. He made tea. Old Black, visible through the kitchen window in the courtyard, arranged itself in a way that, had anyone been anthropomorphizing, suggested satisfaction. The phoenix made a small, warm sound. The kitchen knife was very still and very content. The spirit creature in the storage room poked its head out and then pulled it back in because it seemed like a private moment, which showed good judgment. Xiaolin was in the next room making absolutely no sound at all because she was, as she had said, 12, and not oblivious. They drank tea. They talked until the lamp was almost out. He said, we have a lot to catch up on. She said, we have time. He said, yes, we do. Outside, the gold dragon turned 3 times in the courtyard and then settled into the shape it preferred, which was the pond-adjacent configuration it had been in for 5 years, but without the pretense of being a large fish. The phoenix folded her wings. The small spirit creature went to sleep. The house that had been an extraordinary place disguised as an ordinary one, and an extraordinary person disguised as a normal one, and an extraordinary love disguised as a neighborly friendship, allowed itself to be what it was. Chen Ping'an looked at the woman across the table and thought, I have been the least observant person in my own life, and I am very grateful that the people around me are not. He said, I've been thinking. She said, dangerous. He said, probably. He said, do you want to stay? She said without hesitation, yes. He said, good. He said, Xiaolin will be happy. She said, and you? He said, I think I will need some time to finish being surprised. She said, that's reasonable. He said, also yes. Also I will. She smiled. He looked away because he was a person who had spent 5 years not looking at things clearly and was in the process of learning to, and it required some adjustment. She watched him look away and thought, 5 years of this, and he can still make me feel like the world is doing something remarkable. She thought, this is the best possible version of how this could have gone. She thought, I need to remember to thank whoever arranged it. She had a theory about who had arranged it. She thought, later. For now, tea. For now, this. For now, Chen Ping'an at the kitchen table in the warm lamplight, learning to see what has always been there. That was enough. It was in fact exactly enough. The morning after the revelation was a morning like the ones before it. The same light, the same pond, the same garden, except that everything was the same, and also completely different, in the way that things are when the frame they occupy has changed. Chen Ping'an woke up and felt the difference before he had identified it. Something had settled. Something that had been held in suspension for 5 years had come to rest, and the coming to rest had a quality of rightness that was not dramatic but was comprehensive. He lay in bed for a moment and took stock. The gold dragon he had been calling Old Black was in the pond. The phoenix he had been calling the colorful hen was in the backyard. The kitchen knife was on the counter. Zhang Yuxin, had gone home after midnight, walking through the dark town with the specific certainty of someone who knows the streets, who had been saying goodnight to him for 5 years, and this goodnight had been different from all the others in ways both of them had felt. Xiaolin was asleep in her room. The spirit creature was asleep in the storage room. Everything was where it should be. He got up and made breakfast and went to the pond and looked at Old Black and said, "Good morning." The dragon said, "Good morning." He said, "I'm still adjusting to you talking." The dragon said, "I know." He said, "How long until it feels normal?" The dragon said, "Not long." He said, "Was everything always like this?" The dragon said, "What do you mean?" He said, was everything always the way it is and I just didn't see it?" The dragon said, "Mostly." He said, "Mostly." The dragon said, "There were things that had to arrive before you could see them." He said, "Like Xin." The dragon said, "Like Xin." He thought about this. He said, "And the tasks." The dragon said, "Also the tasks." He said, "The system was preparing me for something." The dragon said, "The system was giving you what you needed." He said, "Is there a difference?" The dragon said, "Yes." He said, "What is it?" The dragon said, "Preparation implies an end point. What you needed was not preparation, it was development. The development is the point, not a step towards something else." He thought about this for a while. He said, "That's a very cultivation world way of saying I was always exactly where I was supposed to be." The dragon said, "Yes." He said, "I would find that annoying if it weren't so completely accurate." The dragon said, "Yes." He went inside and finished breakfast. The task board that morning gave him 3 tasks. The first was, take a meal to the old woman who lived 3 streets down and had not been able to cook for herself since her hands started hurting. The second was, help the young man who worked at the South Market stall reorganize his records, which had become so disorganized that he was losing track of accounts. The third was, find a specific plant on the hill east of town and bring it to a specific location. He read these and thought, this is my life. He thought this not with resignation, but with recognition. This was the life he had built here, task by task, 5 years of it, and the life had become something real and substantial and full of people who had, in various ways, been shaped by contact with it. He packed food for the old woman. He found the old woman whose name was Granny Zhao, and who received the food with the specific gratitude of someone who has been proud and self-sufficient and is learning in old age to accept help from people who offer it without conditions. She said, "You've been bringing things for 6 months." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "The tasks, partly." He said, "Also I like you." She looked at him for a moment and then said, "You're a strange young man." He said, "I've heard that." She said, "It's a compliment." She said, "Eat with me." He ate with her. She told him about her life, which had been long and full and not without sorrow. and he listened with the complete attention that was one of his genuine skills, the ability to make someone feel that what they were saying was the most important thing in the room. When he left, she gave him a jar of preserved plums that she had made the previous autumn and said, "Come back." He said, "I will." He meant it. The records at the South Market stall took most of the morning. The young man's name was Feng, and he was 17 and had inherited the stall from his father, who had inherited it from his father, and none of them had developed a system for the accounts that worked longer than 2 seasons before it collapsed under the weight of its own improvisation. Chen Ping'an sat with the records and Feng for 2 hours, and they worked through it together, creating a system that Feng would actually use, which meant it had to be simple and also had to make sense to the specific way Feng thought about numbers. By the end of it, Feng had a working system and a plan for maintaining it, and the particular quiet confidence of someone who has been shown that a problem they were afraid of is actually manageable. He said, "How did you know to do it that way?" Chen Ping'an said, "I asked how you think." He said, "It's your system. I just helped you find it." Feng said nothing for a moment. He said, "My father always said the accounts were complicated." He said, "My grandfather too." He said, "They weren't, were they?" Chen Ping'an said, "Not really." He said, "They just needed to be organized the way you think." Feng looked at the records. He said, "Thanks." He said it simply, without excess, and Chen Ping'an said, "Of course," and that was the end of it, and both of them felt good about the morning. The plant on the hill east of town was a variety he had encountered before in his garden, something that grew in the soil that was charged with particular energy and which had specific properties that he recognized from 5 years of growing and harvesting things in a very unusual garden. He found it easily. He brought it to the specified location, which was a clearing where a small shrine had stood for 200 years, and where the stone was inscribed with characters that he could read now with a clarity that had not been there 6 months ago, as if his understanding of the language of this world had been slowly deepening in ways that only became obvious when you reached for something and found it there. He placed the plant at the base of the shrine. He stood there for a moment in the clearing. He said, to the air, "I don't know who arranged this one," he said, "but thank you." The clearing was quiet. He thought, this is what 5 years looks like. He thought, a lot of mornings doing small things, a lot of evenings talking to someone across a table, a lot of tasks that didn't seem significant individually, and added up to something that did. He thought, I understand now why the system never let me see ahead. He thought, if I had known what I was building, I would have tried to build it differently. He thought, and it would have been worse. He thought, you can't deliberately build most of the things that matter. You have to earn them task by task. He walked back down the hill into town, and felt the gold dragon in his pawn like a warmth that had always been there and was now allowed to be acknowledged. Xin was at his house when he returned. Not at the restaurant, at his house, in the kitchen, already making something that smelled like the kind of afternoon food that happens when someone knows your kitchen well enough to use it comfortably. Xiaolin was sitting on the counter watching and making suggestions that Xin was accepting with the cheerful tolerance of someone who enjoys collaborative cooking. He stood in the doorway and watched them. He thought, this has been developing for 5 years too. Not just Xin finding him, this specific quality of household, this feeling of people inhabiting a space together with ease. He thought, Old Black watched this. The Phoenix watched this. Everything in this house watched this and waited for me to see it. He said, it smells good. Xin said, without turning around, you're back early. He said, I finished the tasks. She said, all 3? He said, yes. She said, there's a 4th. He said, the system didn't show a 4th. She said, no, there isn't one. She turned around. She was smiling. He said, that was a test. She said, little bit, yes. He said, you're terrible. She said, also yes. He sat at the kitchen table. Xiaolin climbed off the counter and sat across from him. She said, we're making the soup from the market ingredients. He said, the recipe you found? She said, the recipe I invented. He said, that's different. She said, better. He said, almost certainly. He sat and was home and felt the 5 years of tasks and mornings and small things and difficult things and confusing things become what they had been building toward all along, which was exactly this. This kitchen, this table, this day, these people, this specific version of a life that had been given to him sideways through a rift in the fabric of things by what he was increasingly certain was not accident. The visit from the organization that called itself the Heaven's Will Alliance happened without warning, which was how most of the significant things in this period happened. 2 people arrived at his gate, a man and a woman, both clearly cultivators of significant level, both with the bearing of people who represented something larger than themselves. The man knocked. Chen Ping'an came to the door. The man said, "We represent an organization with an interest in the spiritual anomaly in this location." He said, "We've been studying it for some time." He said, "We'd like to discuss it." Chen Ping'an said, "Come in." He said, "I'll make tea." They came in, he made tea. They sat across from him and said, "The readings we've been tracking originate from this location." They said, "Specifically, from you." He said, "From me." They said, "The Tao energy density around you is..." He said, "I know." He said, "I've been told." They said, "You know." He said, "Recently, yes." He said, "I didn't know for 5 years." They looked at each other. The woman said, "May I ask how that's possible?" He said, "The system kept me from seeing it." He said, "I think I needed to develop first." He said, "I was developing." They said, "The tasks." He said, "Yes." The woman said carefully, "Do you know what you are?" He said, "I'm a mortal from another world." She said, "You were." He thought about this. He said, "I'm still the same person." She said, "Yes, but some of the conditions that applied when you arrived here have changed." He said, "Are you telling me I can cultivate now?" She said, "We're telling you the barriers that prevented it have been removed." He said, "By the tasks." She said, "By the accumulation." He said, "Is there a difference?" She said, "What do you think?" He thought about what Old Black had said. He said, "Development." She nodded. He said, "So what now?" She said, "That's up to you." He thought about this. He thought about 5 years of doing tasks. He thought about the fact that he had been doing those tasks not to become something, but because they were the right things to do, and the doing of them was its own point. He said, "What I want is to keep doing what I've been doing." He said, "I want to keep making dinner and tending the garden and completing tasks and being available when people need something." He said, "If I can cultivate on top of that, I'll figure out how." He said, "But I'm not going to change what I'm doing to optimize for cultivation." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "That's a very unusual answer." He said, "Probably." He said, "Is that a problem?" She said, "No." She said, "It's just..." She said, "Most people, when told they can cultivate, ask about speed." He said, "I'm not most people." She said, "No." She said, "You're really not." They drank their tea. They left. Outside his gate, the woman said to the man, "We'll come back." He said, "Yes." She said, "He's going to be significant." He said, "He already is." She said, "More significant." He said, "Yes." The daily rhythm continued, tasks and mornings and dinners and evenings. The gold dragon visible now in the courtyard pond without disguise, which meant that anyone approaching the property saw it, and this produced reactions ranging from immediate prostration to slow backing away to, in one memorable case, a cultivator of considerable seniority who sat down in the road outside the gate and simply refused to move for about 20 minutes while processing the existence of a gold dragon being used decoratively. Chen Ping'an went out and helped the cultivator up and offered tea, and the cultivator came in and had tea and left 2 hours later with his cultivation having done several things it hadn't done in years, and a fundamental revision of his understanding of what ordinary meant. He told other people. The word spread differently now, not as rumor or mystery, but as genuine accounts from people who had been there, who had sat at the kitchen table, who had heard the music, who had eaten the food. The accounts were consistent, and they were, in their consistency, impossible to dismiss. The small town was gradually becoming a place that people came to intentionally, not as a pilgrimage site, nothing so formal, more the way that people go to places where the air is good and the company is honest and the tea is excellent and something happens to them that they don't entirely have words for, but that leaves them better than they arrived. Chen Ping'an noticed this and adjusted the table to accommodate more people. He stocked more tea. He kept completing his tasks, which continued to be assigned with the same consistency and the same ordinariness, as if the system had decided that what had worked for 5 years would continue to work, and there was no reason to change it. He agreed with this assessment. Xin moved the restaurant. She moved it from the street where it had been to a street adjacent to the lane where his house was, and she did this with the practical efficiency of someone who has decided something and is implementing it. She said, "I spent 5 years going to your house every evening." She said, "It's more convenient this way." He said, "That's very practical." She said, "Yes." She said, "I'm a practical person." He said, "I know." He said, "I've known for 5 years apparently." She said, "You knew, you just didn't know what it meant." He said, "I have a lot of things in that category." She said, "You're working through them." He said, "Yes." He said, "At my own pace." She said, "At your pace?" "Yes." She said, "I'll be here." He said, "I know." He meant it. She meant it. It was the most ordinary exchange possible, and it was also completely definitive. Shaolin, overhearing from the next room, made a sound that could only be described as satisfied. The spirit creature in the storage room also made a small sound. Old Black rippled the pond. The phoenix did not make a sound, but the quality of her attention changed in a way that functioned as an endorsement. The kitchen knife was absolutely still in the specific way of things that are very pleased, and expressing it through stillness. That evening, after Xin had gone to the restaurant and Shaolin had gone to sleep, Chen Ping'an sat alone in the courtyard in the dark. The gold dragon was at the surface of the pond, the gold of it catching the starlight. He sat, and he thought about 5 years. He thought about the task board, and the mop, and the marital disputes, and the children's toys, and the mornings of gardening, and the evenings of cooking, and the 1,000 small things that had accumulated into whatever this was. He thought about the way he had arrived here not knowing anything, not knowing what the world was, not knowing how it worked, not knowing what he was, or what he was building, or where any of it was going. He thought about the way the not knowing had been, at first, frightening, and then tolerable, and then somehow comfortable, and how in the comfort of it he had built something real. He thought about Xin. He thought about Shaolin. He thought about Old Black and the phoenix and the knife and the small creature and the dinners and the music and the old woman and the young market man and all the people who had passed through his table and his courtyard and his life. He thought, I didn't know any of this was happening. He thought, and yet here it is. He thought, the universe, whatever it is, gave me 5 years of ordinary tasks and an impossible house and a gold dragon in my pond and the woman I should have found years ago living next door, and it did this by making me too oblivious to overthink any of it. He thought that's either the cruelest joke or the kindest gift. He thought, it's probably both. Old Black surfaced a little more. He said, yes. Chen Ping'an said, did I say that out loud? Old Black said, you didn't need to. He said, I know. He said, you've always known, haven't you? Old Black said, yes. He said, then you know I'm grateful. Old Black said, I know. He said, even if it took me 5 years to see it. Old Black said, yes. He said, is there anything I missed that I should know about? Old Black was quiet for a moment. Then it said, the chicken. He looked toward the backyard. He said, the phoenix. Old Black said, she doesn't like being called a chicken. He said, I know. He said, I'm going to need to apologize for that. Old Black said, yes. He said, will she accept it? Old Black said, she finds you very endearing. He said, that's a yes. Old Black said, yes. He looked at the sky. He thought, tomorrow there will be tasks. He thought, tomorrow there will be mornings and dinners and evenings and people and small things and large things and everything in between. He thought, that is my life. He thought for the first time without any qualification, without any hesitation, without any remaining ambiguity, and it is exactly what I want. He went inside. He went to sleep. The courtyard was warm. The gold dragon kept watch. The phoenix attended to things that eyes couldn't see. The house held everything it contained with the ease of long practice. And Chen Ping'an, mortal and extraordinary and complete, slept soundly in the middle of all of it, at home at last in the life he had been building all along without knowing what it was. There is a thing that happens to places where the Tao accumulates over time, the same way a river carves stone not by force but by consistency, by the unremarkable repetition of being there. Chen Ping'an's house had been accumulating for 5 years, and in those 5 years it had become something that the cultivation world's theoretical framework had no category for. A place of power that had not been deliberately constructed, that had no formation array anchoring it, that followed no principles of artificial cultivation, a place that had simply become powerful because of who lived in it and how they lived. The rocks in the courtyard had absorbed it. The wood of the door frames had absorbed it. The well in the corner ran water that was, in the most literal sense possible, the most spiritually pure water available at that level of existence in the known world, and it ran constantly, available to anyone who came and asked for a cup. The garden grew things that the cultivation world catalogued as rare, and grew them in profusion, renewed season after season, without effort on anyone's part beyond Chen Ping'an watering them in the mornings and talking to them the way he talked to everything, conversationally, as if the object of his speech were reasonable and interested, which it turned out they were. Old Black had listened to these conversations for 5 years. The dragon had decided, after extensive observation, that this was perhaps the most unusual mortal it had ever encountered, and also that it had encountered him at exactly the right moment, and also that it had no intention of going anywhere. These decisions had been made simultaneously and with the same certainty. They had not changed. The phoenix had a different relationship with the situation, as phoenixes do with everything. More oblique, more patient, more concerned with the quality of attention than with its object. She had been watching Chen Ping'an for 5 years with the specific interest that phoenixes reserve for things they consider significant, and she had been allowing herself to be called a hen, with the specific tolerance that phoenixes develop when they have decided that a relationship is worth the indignity of its early stages. She had seen the evenings with Xin, she had seen the mornings with Shaolin, she had seen the completion of task after task after task, the old women and the young market men and the children's toys and the marital disputes and the 1,000 small unremarkable good deeds that were, in aggregate, the most remarkable thing she had observed in her very long existence. She did not have a cultivation world word for what Chen Ping'an was. She had her own word, in the language that phoenixes used for things that mattered, but she saw no reason to translate it. It meant, approximately, someone who has chosen correctly so many times that the choices have become their nature. It meant, someone in whom goodness is structural rather than deliberate. It meant, the kind of person that the universe sometimes, rarely produces, who changes the world around them not by doing great things, but by being a particular quality of themselves. She ruffled her feathers and made her small, warm sound and kept her watch. The kitchen knife had its own understanding of things. It had come to Chen Ping'an through a chain of circumstances that it was aware of, but did not discuss, because the kitchen knife had decided in approximately its first week of being used to cut vegetables that discussing one's origins and nature with people who were not ready to receive the information was counterproductive. The knife had been many places. It had been held by many hands. None of them had done what Chen Ping'an had done with it, which was to use it for cutting vegetables and occasionally firewood, and to regard it with the general affectionate practicality with which he regarded all his tools. The knife had spent centuries being treated as what it was, an object of terrible power, handled with the specific reverence that powerful objects receive, kept in cases, only brought out for significant events, surrounded by the anxiety that always accumulates around things of great importance. Chen Ping'an had put it on a hook in the kitchen. He had used it to cut daikon and then put it back on the hook. He had on several occasions expressed mild frustration at having to sharpen it, because a good blade should stay sharp longer. The knife found this more moving than anything any other wielder had expressed toward it. It had developed opinions about the best way to cut daikon. It had developed preferences about the kitchen in the morning versus the kitchen in the evening. It had, in short, been allowed to exist rather than to be significant, and had found this to be the most significant thing that had ever happened to it. The spirit creature in the storage room had come a long way from where it had started. It had started as something that lived in fear, not the healthy fear of real dangers, but the accumulated anxiety of years of being something small in a world of large things. It had been chased and threatened and used and discarded, and it had developed, in response to this, a set of survival behaviors that it now recognized had been entirely unnecessary in this household from the moment it arrived. Nothing in this household had threatened it. Everything in this household had, in its own way, made space for it. The gold dragon, when it finally surfaced openly, had acknowledged the small creature with a glance that communicated, "You may stay." The phoenix had acknowledged it by not eating it, which was more of a gift than it sounded. The kitchen knife had acknowledged it by ignoring it in a way that felt like acceptance. Shaolin had given it food. Chen Ping'an had said it was welcome to stay if it wanted. It wanted. It had made a home in the storage room, and it was, for the first time in its existence, comfortable. It had begun, tentatively, to develop something that it did not have a name for, but that functioned as contentment. It was a small life in the shadow of very large things, and it found that this was enough. More than enough. It was, in the specific way that specific things are for specific creatures, exactly right. Mulong Shui came by regularly. She had been given permission by her father to be less formal about it, which meant she arrived when she wanted, usually in the late afternoon, usually with something she said was a gift, but which Chen Ping'an suspected was a pretext. She sat in the courtyard with him sometimes, and they talked about cultivation, she talking about theory and practice from the inside, he listening and asking questions that were, she had noticed, exactly the questions that cut to the structural issues with whatever she was describing. He couldn't cultivate from the inside. He understood cultivation from the outside with a clarity that she found genuinely disorienting, because outside clarity of that quality was not supposed to exist without the inside experience to produce it. She had mentioned this to her father. Her father had said, "He's been surrounded by the deepest cultivation in existence for 5 years. He has absorbed it the way wood absorbs water. He does not practice cultivation. He has become fluent in it." She thought about this. She thought, that's exactly what it is. He's not a cultivator. He's fluent in the Tao. She found this distinction very interesting and continued to think about it. Zhang Xian had stopped coming with Mu Long Yunhai and had started coming separately. He came in the mornings sometimes and drank 1 cup of tea and sat in the courtyard for a while and then left. He did not always talk. He had explained this by saying, "I come for the air." He meant this literally. The ambient spiritual environment of the courtyard was more conducive to the specific kind of cultivation state he was working on than anything he had been able to produce in his own sect. He sat in it like medicine. He thanked Chen Ping'an when he left. Chen Ping'an said, "The courtyard is always open." He meant this. It remained open. The mornings when Zhang Xian came, and the mornings when he didn't, were both good mornings, in the specific way that a place which has more than enough doesn't diminish when some of it is shared. The sect at large, both Leaning Mountain and Changing Moon, had begun to reorganize itself around certain understandings. The primary understanding was, there is a place in the small town, and a person at that place, and being in contact with that person, and that place is good for cultivation, and being good for cultivation is good for sex, and being good for sex means this place and person should be supported and maintained without being managed. The nuance in that last part had taken several meetings to establish. Mulong Yunhai had had to say clearly and to multiple senior elders that the correct relationship was not patronage or management or study, but simple good neighboring. He said, "He makes dinner." He said, "Come for dinner and be a neighbor, and that's all." He said, "If you try to extract value from this, you will fail, and you will deserve to fail, and I will not help you." The elders had nodded and understood, and most of them had followed the instruction. A few had tried to extract value and had experienced the specific confusion of people who are attempting to measure something that is not measurable, and finding that all their instruments produce the same result, which was, "Everything here is fine. Nothing here can be leveraged. Go home and think about why you came. They went home. Some of them thought about it. Some of them came back as neighbors, properly, and stayed. The task board continued. Everyday tasks, delivered every morning, completed every day, rewarded with things that fit into the life rather than transforming it. He had been given, over the 5 years, enough spiritually enhanced soil to make the garden perpetually excellent, enough good pots and tools to make the kitchen excellent, enough small useful things to make the house excellent, in the specific ways that a house becomes excellent through accumulation of good small things. He had been given, through the task structure, 5 years of practice at the most fundamental skills of being present with people, listening, observing, finding what was actually needed rather than what was asked for, acting on that without requiring acknowledgement. He had been given, through the accumulation of daily contact with the objects in his house, a resonance with the deepest levels of the Tao that no cultivation program could have deliberately produced. He had been given, through the management of his memory and his perception, and the timing of revelations, the chance to develop into someone who could receive all of it when it arrived without being overwhelmed. The system had been, in short, exactly what it appeared to be. Not a hero's training program, not a path to power, but a structure for becoming the specific kind of person that this specific life required. He had followed it with the trust of someone who did not know they were trusting, which was the only way you could actually follow it. He looked at the morning task board and read the instructions and thought, right. He packed what he needed. He went out. He helped Granny Zhao with her jar collection, which had become unmanageable over the winter and needed reorganizing. He showed Feng the improved version of the account system that he had been working on based on their conversation 3 months ago. He visited a family in the lower district who had been having difficulty with a neighbor over a fence line and sat with both parties and listened to both sides, and helped them draw a diagram that resolved the dispute, not by deciding who was right, but by showing them that the two positions were not actually incompatible. He bought vegetables at the market and stopped to talk to 3 people he knew, and 1 person he didn't, who turned out to be interesting. He came home. He made dinner. The table filled. People came who had been before and people who had not, and the table expanded to accommodate them because it always did, because something about the house had always had more room than it appeared to, and because Chen Ping'an had a long time ago made peace with the fact that his dinner table was a semi-public institution. He cooked for all of them. He ate with all of them. He talked and listened and was present. Afterward, the kitchen was cleaned by everyone together because that was what happened at his table, and the guests left gradually, and eventually it was just him and Xin and Shaolin, and then it was just him and Xin, and then it was just him, and he sat in the quiet kitchen and felt the specific peace of an evening that has been fully inhabited. He thought, this is what I do. He thought, this is what I am. He thought, every morning there will be tasks, and every evening there will be this, and in between there will be everything that life in this world contains, which is considerable and unpredictable and often inexplicable and always somehow fine. He thought, I am going to be here for a long time. He thought, I'm glad. He went to bed. Old Black kept watch. The Phoenix kept her counsel. The house held everything it had been given. The next morning came, and with it the task board, and another ordinary, extraordinary day began. This is the life. This is who he is. This is Chen Ping'an.